Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, you mentioned tougher bail restrictions in your opening statement, and in the 2024-25 departmental plan, it does mention a key priority being supporting survivors and victims of crime. I'd be curious to know why you think police officers like Sergeant Lisa Harris from Newfoundland and Labrador had to appear before the Status of Women Committee last week asking your government for stricter bail conditions, and why police unions across the country right now are begging you publicly to introduce stricter bail conditions if you believe you've already delivered that.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Giovanni, for the question. So what I'd say is that we heard loudly and clearly about the need for bail reform, and we responded to that request that came about 18 months ago. What I'd say about police is that I understand the concerns about police. I feel their concerns. I also know that in my city, close to where you represent, sir, we have 700 less police officers amongst the Toronto Police Service than we did when Bill Blair was the chief of police. I think we need more policing, but we also need more resources dedicated by provinces in things like courtrooms, crowns, JPs, and detention facilities.
There's this sort of condescension in what you're saying, though, when police officers use their voice to express their concerns and you just sort of dismiss it as, well, we dealt with this 18 months ago. They're tweeting at you now asking for stricter bail conditions. And, you know, I've seen you respond to the Ontario government, for example, and suggest that bail law is very difficult to interpret for those without a background in law. There seems to be a streak of condescension, and I'm asking you quite clearly if you're willing to take any responsibility for the problem that police officers are articulating to you, the problem that survivors and victims are articulating to you now.
I take a lot of responsibility for keeping Canadians safe. That is my job. I respect the job that police officers are doing in terms of putting themselves in the line of fire to keep us safe. What I also take cues from are from police officers, including Deputy Chief Alvaro Almeida, who has said in York Region that the problem is resourcing in the system, including the availability of court space and crowns. The National Police Federation, an umbrella organization that represents officers around the country, has pointed out the exact point that I've been making, which is that in some jurisdictions, JPs need to have legal training if they're going to make decisions about charter interests. That is not the case in Ontario, and that's an open question as to why.
So I've heard you make this point before, and ordinarily when you speak, you seem to leave out entirely the principle of restraint, the part of the criminal code which many people point to as a source for a lot of the bail issues in our country right now. I'm wondering if you will admit today that the principle of restraint being introduced by your government was a mistake, and that is actually a big part of the problem, that you have not used your powers through the criminal code to enforce as strict bail conditions as many of these stakeholders, these police officers, these victims, these survivors are asking you to do.
So what I'd say, Mr. Giovanni, this predates your time in the Parliament, but when we passed Bill 75, what we were doing is codifying Supreme Court case law, including decisions like Antic and Zora. Nothing changed in terms of the jurisprudence being transferred into black letter law in the statute. In fact, the only thing that did actively change was imposing a reverse onus on people that commit intimate partner violence, making bail more difficult for those individuals. So I appreciate the concern you're voicing. I appreciate the crisis that is happening on our streets. I appreciate the crisis of confidence that Canadians feel in terms of when they see people being let out on bail who have been subject to repeat offences. The second ground of bail, it's called there's a primary, tertiary, secondary, tertiary ground, is a serious risk of reoffending. That test needs to be applied adequately by the adjudicators, and that involves also having space to house people.
I understand. The issue, though, and you love to bring up that I'm one of the relatively new MPs, but you've been here for 9 years, and when people hear you speak like someone who takes no responsibility for any of the problems in the system. This is the source of frustration. And when you also fail to acknowledge that the principle of restraint in the criminal code is a problem for people, you might disagree with them, but at least acknowledge that their point of view is legitimate, that when police officers ask you to make change, they're coming from an informed position. When victims and survivors ask you to make change, they're coming from an informed position. When provincial governments ask you to make change, they are coming from an informed position. And you continue to take this posture that you know everything, that everybody's wrong, that I just got here. You've been here for 9 years, but somehow that means that you know what you're talking about and I don't. And yet what I'm relaying to you is not my opinion. What I'm relaying to you is what we are hearing from Canadians and organizations across our country. So are you taking the position that everybody just doesn't know as much as you do, and they just simply need to maybe read more of your tweets or your posts to understand better what's going on in the country?
With all due respect, Mr.
So,
Giovanni,
Minister,
my
you
response
have
to your,
time to respond,
yeah,
and
my
that'll
response
be
to your
time.
earlier,
No,
pardon?
you've got 50 seconds, and that'll
Thank
be
you.
time.
With all due respect, Mr. Giovanni, when you asked me, do I take responsibility? I said that is my responsibility. So I take responsibility. I've just said it, and I've said it twice, Mr. Giovanni.
If I can
continue,
do it.
If I can continue, what I would say to you is that I'm also taking cues from all of the stakeholders in the system. And what is fundamental for Canadians to understand is that you can amend the criminal code, but the implementation of law enforcement is something that resides at the municipal level and at the provincial level. And when I hear Donna Kelway of the Ontario Crown Attorneys Association lamenting the lack of resources so that there are enough crowns to argue about bail, yes, I think that's something that needs to be remedied at the provincial level. When I hear justices of the peace lamenting the fact that the Toronto South Detention Centre is so overcrowded that it resembles third world conditions, there's yet another article in today's news about that very issue. We're jeopardizing the entire criminal justice system. So we need amendments to the criminal code, some of which I've delivered, and I'm willing to entertain more suggestions for further. But what I would say secondly is that we, if I could finish, Mr. Giovanni, what I would say secondarily is that we need more cops, more crowns, JPs with legal training, detention centres, and we need data. The fact that we don't have the data, and yet Mr. Ford's governance of the criminal justice system is resulting in more than 50% of sexual assault charges being stayed or withdrawn is a problem for everyone in Ontario, including the victims that want to have their day in court. And they're not getting that because there's not enough resources being dedicated to the system.
So thank you.